Okay. Hello, everyone. This is Lisa Ruggiero. I am the project coordinator at the Syracuse Environmental Finance Center. Just really quickly, I want to do a sound check. Can Heather, Ross, and Dawn hear me?
Yes, I can.
Yes, we can, thanks.
Okay, super. Okay, on behalf of the Environmental Finance Center Network, I would like to welcome you to our webinar entitled Ask the Expert, a unique opportunity to ask your asset management questions or seek advice on how to begin. I will be providing some technical support for today's session. Please take a moment to observe your GoToWebinar control panel. Most of the functions are self-explanatory, but I'd like to draw your attention to the questions section on your control panel. During today's session, you will all be kept on mute to ensure audio quality and minimize background noise. Should you have a question, please type it into the GoToWebinar question dialog box and specify who you would like to answer it. We have 108 registrants for the webinar today, and we'll try to get to as many questions as we can. Today's presenters have consented to share their presentation slides with you, and we will make the slides available as well as a video recording following the webinar on the EFCN website at efcnetwork.org. And now it is my pleasure to turn the presentation over to Heather Himmelberger and Ross Waugh.
Good afternoon, everyone. This is Heather, and I'm the director of the Southwest Environmental Finance Center here at the University of New Mexico, and I'm part of the Environmental Finance Center Network team that is currently in round 2 of our project with the Environmental Protection Agency that we call Smart Management for Small Water Systems. And for the purposes of this project, a small water system is defined as any system serving 10,000 customers or fewer. And we're working with this year any system that's less than 10,000, so that includes all community systems, non-community non-transients, and transient non-community systems. So under this round of funding, we'll be able to work pretty much with anybody who is less than 10,000 in population. This is actually our kickoff webinar for that project. We just started July 1st, and we're in the process of talking to all the states and EPA to kind of coordinate what assistance we will be providing in person and one-on-one with water systems throughout the next 18 months. And we will be doing a series of probably about 17 or so webinars throughout the next 18 months, and this is essentially our first kickoff webinar on our asset management series. This one we're doing a little bit differently. It's a open question and answer forum, so anytime throughout the webinar that you have any questions, please feel free to type those in. We'll do a little bit of discussion first as to give you a chance to pose your questions, and then we'll be happy to answer those. And with me today, I'm very excited to have Ross Waugh with me. He's in New Zealand, so I will let Ross say a few words about himself and introduce where he is, but he was on our previous Ask the Expert webinar that we did in April, and so I'm very delighted to have him back with us. He does lots of asset management related work in Australia and New Zealand. So Ross, why don't you tell the group a little bit about yourself?
Well, thank you, Heather, and very nice to be joining you here from New Zealand. At the moment, just so you know, it's Thursday, the 28th of August in New Zealand. We're in a different time zone to the US, clearly, and 7 a.m. or just after 7 a.m. So the sun is just coming up. For those of you who are wondering what tomorrow will be like, I can tell you it's very pleasant. It's a nice day. The sun is still shining, and it seems the world is still turning. So that's the news flash for the US, that tomorrow is going to be all right. Apart from that, as Heather said, I do a lot of asset management work around New Zealand, and collaborated with some projects with Heather, and presented at conferences on occasion in the US. And really looking forward to this webinar. Heather and I did a previous webinar back in late April when I was visiting with her in Albuquerque, and that was a lot of fun. So looking forward to your questions today, and also just interacting with Heather and the team.
Okay, why don't we put the slide with the map up? There's a slide that actually shows where everybody's located today. So you can see we have a pretty good cross-section across the United States. It's always kind of fun to see who else is online with us today. So we have a pretty good stretch going. And the other announcement I wanted to make before we get started is I think it was listed originally as a 2-hour webinar. We're planning on having the webinar be about 90 minutes today. So that's our goal, is to maybe have a discussion for 90 minutes. Unless we're really getting lots and lots of questions, maybe we'll extend a little bit, but our intent is to have about a 90-minute webinar. So with that, why don't we put the first slide up? And actually, Ross gets to show you the view from where he is in New Zealand.
It's winter here still too, just the end of it, so we've still got a bit of snow on the hills, and that is pretty much what I can look at out the office window, so it's very pleasant.
So if anybody out there is warm, you can sort of think about the snow and feel a little bit better. Okay, so
very nearly 0 degrees this morning, so not quite. I think about 2 or 3, so a nice brisk start to the day, Heather.
Exactly. All right, so clicking on to the next one. What we thought we'd do is talk a little bit about a recent event that you may have heard about, particularly if you're in the field of water resources, water distribution, water treatment. You might have heard about the LA water main break that occurred a couple of weeks ago. This was a 30-inch, 93-year-old pipe, and it broke, flooded the streets, flooded some parking garages, caused a lot of havoc, and it also damaged a basketball stadium that they had just renovated on the UCLA campus. So it caused some major damage. What was really interesting about this particular event is that afterwards it came out in the media that Los Angeles was on a 300-year replacement cycle. And what that means is that they intended to replace pipe 300 years after it was put in place. So their intent was that this piece of pipe that was 93 years old would have had to remain in the ground for another 200 years. And that's a pretty optimistic scenario, that you could get 300 years out of a steel pipe. And clearly they did not get the 300 years that they were hoping for. So what that means is that they were having, they have had a lot of damage that they're now going to have to pay for, rather than to pay for the actual pipe replacement. So if you can compare the pipe replacement cost to the damage cost, it would be much more beneficial to them to have replaced it beforehand in a more planned manner, rather than waiting till this pipeline broke. So Ross, I know you did a blog post on the infomanage.com website. Do you want to tell them a little bit about what you were talking about in terms of their replacement cycle and how that's had impacts for Los Angeles?
Heather, I first let's just do a little Q&A with you on this incident. So we've 30-inch steel pipe, and just ballpark, if you were going to replace maybe 100 feet of that, what sort of numbers would we be talking about in that sort of built-up environment?
Well, you know, we see costs anywhere from about $100 a lineal foot to a couple $100 a lineal foot, and I'm guessing in LA with their environment they'd be up the higher end. We generally ballpark use about $500,000 a mile to replace, you know, in a moderate community. So I'm guessing they're on the higher side of that, maybe more like $750,000 to do a mile of pipe, somewhere in that neck of the woods.
Okay, so if we were to say, just like round figures, worst case for them for a planned replacement is $1 million. The thought I had, and you started listing all the damage that was done there, but I've been involved in incidents, not flooding a university basketball stadium or anything like that, but certainly incidents when I was back in operational engineering, where we've had breaks that have been, just caused a whole heap of problems and had emergency response, and they can be really expensive to get under control, and then to deal with the cleanup of the mess. And so I looked at this LA one, and I say, well, if it's $1 million to do a planned replacement, what did that incident cost them? And they've still got to do the planned replacement. So first up, they've got the $1 million still to just fix a pipe that's obviously not in very good condition. But what would be all the add-on costs?
You mean besides the pipeline itself as well?
Yeah. Like you've got the emergency response cost. Obviously, you're going to have litigation around the cars that were damaged and the housing that was damaged. I would have thought you've got insurance claims or litigation from UCLA regarding the damage to their stadium and loss of use and all those sorts of things. See, to me, that's got to add several $1 million more to that equation. Is that about right?
Yeah, I think so. And so I think, the main point we wanted to make with this one, or one thing that sort of came to my mind, is a lot of people are on maybe even a longer than 300-year replacement cycle because they don't really want to invest in the infrastructure. So they have chosen to assume that the infrastructure will last as long as possible, or actually longer than it realistically will last, and they've stretched out the replacement cycles maybe 300, 400 years, and that saying, wishing don't make it so, is really appropriate here. You can wish that your pipelines will last 300 years, but that won't make them last 300 years. So then you'll have to pay for replacements under these types of conditions where the pipeline is a major problem. Maybe it creates a sinkhole, maybe it shuts down a street, maybe it closes off businesses, any of those kinds of things could happen, or it could cause a lot of problems with maybe a hospital or school, whatever. And it would be so much better to be in a planned mode, even though we don't like to think about raising rates and putting money aside for capital replacement. We're so much better off if we look on the planned side, because if we don't pay now, we will pay later. And we will pay more later. So that's one of the reasons that we really want asset management to be practiced, is because ultimately it's much, much cheaper to put a city on, say, maybe a 125-year replacement cycle, or at worst maybe a 150-year replacement cycle, so that they're getting the pipes replaced in a much more planned, proactive manner.
And I think, Heather, one of the questions that I know you get quite often, and we certainly get as well, and in New Zealand we're 18, getting close to 20 years down the track of asset management being mandated by law. But the question you have is, what's the return on investment on asset management? And it's a really valid question from anybody in a senior engineering or management role. And this LA incident is one of the answers to that question. They're going to spend, let's say, at the $3 to $4 million still replacing that pipeline, and also all the wash up out of that emergency break. They've had reputational damage. I mean, it was on our main evening news here in New Zealand. It was so spectacular. And so, right around the world, the city of LA, everybody knows they've got old pipes that are breaking. You've got this issue that the council or the board of governors, whoever's looking after that system, they're wondering about the advice they've been getting from their team now as to whether they can trust it. So there's all those organisational issues that flow on. But to me, I'd much rather be spending, the extra couple of $1 million that's going to get washed away with this break. That would have gone a long way down the track to a pretty good asset management program. Get all those numbers out on the table so that everybody can have a look at them, get the risks out on the table, and then have the discussion about what's a pretty good program to deal with those risks, and where you think your network's going to end up in terms of replacement cycles, and then secondly, you've got the information to have a pretty good argument or discussion both with your governance and also with your community, hey, this is what we actually need to spend on the system to keep it going in a way that it isn't going to fall to bits on us. And yeah, that's the guts of it, isn't it? So it's a better way to do business than fixing breaks like that one, that's for sure.
And now you can always tell your bosses, your decision makers, whoever's in charge of whether you get to do asset management or not, you can say, we don't want to be LA. This is not where we want to be. We want to be in a planned, proactive mode, which is much, much cheaper. And this very graphic example is one way to show it is more expensive to wait until a very catastrophic event like this occurs, as opposed to fixing it ahead of time.
Yeah, I mean, I think at minimum we think that the industry figures is generally at least 3 times the planned replacement cost. And in worst case scenarios, it can get upwards of 10 times the planned replacement cost. And that's a lot of money that you're just wasting. The flip side of it is on the ROI question is if you do asset management well, you don't see these things, and then everybody goes, oh, why are we spending the money? And so from an engineering and a management point of view, you say, well, much better to do this well. Not waste the money, but you need to be able to tell that story as well to your decision makers.
Okay, Dawn, it looks like maybe there's some questions coming in, so what questions do we have thus far?
The first question is from Sharon, and she asks, what is the best way to determine an appropriate level of service for a community water or wastewater system?
Ross, why don't you start? I think you have a good answer about looking where you are right now.
Yeah, and thanks for the questions, Sharon. That's a good question because everybody has to answer it, and I think the answer is document what you're doing right now. That's the starting point. Levels of service for community water and wastewater systems they don't just arrive out of nowhere. You're actually delivering service now, and that's at a level that your community's presumably been reasonably happy with. It's evolved over time. So there's about 3 things that you have to look at. The first is you will have regulations and state and federal laws and local ordinances and things like that that you're required to meet. So they set for community water and wastewater and other systems and networks, they will set a minimum service level. So it's just a matter of doing a stock take on those. Are we meeting all of those? One of the things we found in New Zealand when we did that back in the mid-90s was, hey, there's a few laws that we aren't really meeting that well. There's some gaps, there's some issues, and so that starts a really good conversation within the organisation straight up. But obviously, water supply and wastewater are generally regulated systems, and that's a good starting point. The second thing is to look at how you're delivering your service operationally, and so that might deal with, if I have a break or I have an outage or whatever it is, what sort of response times I'm looking at. It might come down to what sort of pressures you're trying to deliver at boundary or at tap. It might be flow rates, those sorts of things. And so you can come up with some suitable figures there. And again, be guided by your current practice. What's appropriate to your community might be quite different for another community. And examples I'm thinking of is we have communities in New Zealand, much the same as in the US, where there's a fair bit of travel. Like you might have the base in a central town, and the service guys might have to drive for an hour to get out to the outlying town, or even 2 hours or longer. And inside the area they're looking after. Well, there's no use having a half-hour response time if you've got a 2-hour drive to get to any particular site. So it's just conditioning that to what works for your community and what's acceptable. And I'm not suggesting a half-hour response time is a good idea. I'm just using that as an example. And then it's just that'll give you a really good basis for going forward. The other thing with service levels is to realise is that they sit at 2 levels, and this was the mistake we made years ago, and we've sorted it out over here now. There's the service levels that your community that are expressed in terms that community understands. So, like, I have water I can drink. It's enough pressure, and it's there all the time. Those are the sorts of statements that are, I guess, community-orientated service levels. Another one might be if you've got firefighting capacity in that particular system. You know, we've got enough water for firefighting. And so you have community service levels, but then at the secondary level, you have these technical ones. So then your pressure is so many pound per square inch of pressure at boundary or at tap. Your firefighting you would express in gallons per minute or gallons per hour, or what, those sorts of things. So then you're getting into your more the stuff that you need to measure as an authority, but really your consumers aren't that interested in. And the mistake we made, a decade and a half ago, is that we did all the technical service levels, because as organisations, that's how we were thinking, and put them up there. And you know, the elected representatives, the boards, the councils, and the community, their eyes glazed over, because that's not how they think. Wastewater, you know, people want to. I want to be able to go to the bathroom. I want to be able to flush. I want it to go away, and I don't want it bubbling up on the street. You know, and I want to know I'm not polluting the environment. Those sorts of service levels. Inside that, there's a whole heap of technical service levels again that an organisation might run. So that's the first thing. The second thing is don't have too many. And again, you tend to do that. You tend to write a great big long list of them. And the trick from there is to just group them up a little bit and not make if you're going to measure them, just pick the ones that are important and measure those, because otherwise you end up spending all day measuring service levels and not actually delivering service. And so that's a little trap to watch out for as well. You might want to add something to that, Heather.
Yeah, I would just like to echo a lot of what Ross just said in saying that there really are a finite number of things that your customers care about, which makes it kind of nice in the water arena, because you don't have 1,000 things that customers are going to be asking for. So they're typically, you know, looking at quality things, where that's, you know, are you meeting regulations and that type of thing. And then maybe some aesthetic concerns, the look, the taste, the, you know, what does the water appear like to you? They're typically concerned some about aesthetics. And then usually pressure is important, although they might not understand pressure per se. They want the water to come out of a second-story bathroom shower with enough force, so they understand it more in intuitive terms maybe than actual numbers. And then they like some kind of customer service. You know, if they call you, how fast will it be before you respond to them? Or if a break occurs in their, you know, driveway, outside their driveway in the street, how quickly are you going to get to them? But there's not lots and lots and lots and lots of other things that they care about. So if you focus on the main things, you know, as Ross was mentioning, focus on the main things that they care about. Look at, you know, what you're doing now and whether or not that is adequate, or you need to tighten up some of those or change some of those. Like, do you get a lot of complaints from customers that the pressure is not high enough? You know, if you do, maybe you need to raise the pressure and look at that. If you don't get a lot of complaints and, you know, things are going well, then you might have a very good pressure and you just need to maintain that. You don't need to change that service level. So I think if you really focus in on those things that customers really care about, set your service levels for those things as a good starting place, and then over time you can add in either some technical service levels like Ross was talking about that are more internal to the system, or maybe a few other customer service levels of things that they might want. But it doesn't have to be a huge list of things. It should just be something you could manage that really hit the high points, and then I think you would be doing pretty well.
Yeah, I think the other thing is start simple, make it more complicated if you need to as you go along, and don't be afraid to go and talk to your field service guys, be it if you've got a contractor or your own team, and just find out what they think they're delivering. That in itself can just start a really, really good conversation with an organisation, and you might find that what you think you're delivering is actually quite different from the reality of what's been delivered, and then that can you can use service level writing them out as a really good organisational tool to just determine that everything's as you think it is and that you are delivering the service that you're promising.
Okay, Dawn, do you have another question for us?
There are a couple of more specifically about level of service. I'm going to let you have both of those at once. The first is, in order to have an effective level of service, do you need the input of your customers? And the second, about level of service, builds on that some. Why do utilities hesitate to do a level of service agreement, and how can we help with getting over that fear?
Well, I will say I'll take a stab at some comments, and then I'll turn it over to Ross to add some, because I know they've done a lot in New Zealand about involving customers. And my thought is that the best way to do level of service is to involve customers. However, knowing the reality for many small water systems, I know that it's difficult to do that. So my suggestion is to start with, again, setting levels that you believe currently exist within the system, and then talk to your customers about the levels that you have, either at an annual meeting if you do that, maybe a customer survey. You know, try to find some way to start getting some customer input going forward so you can see if you need to revise those customer service levels. For example, you know, we mentioned about pressures and whether pressures are adequate within the system or not. If you set the pressure at, say, 60 psi as your minimum, or that's what you try to maintain within your system, and maybe you say, well, we're trying to do between 60 and 70 psi, you can start polling your customers and saying, you know, do you feel like the pressure at your house is adequate? You don't necessarily have to say, do you like 60 psi, because a lot of people will have no idea what you're talking about. But you might be able to ask them, do you have any concerns about pressure? Do you have issues with that? So you can start to get some customer feedback over time. But you can take an initial stab at setting those customer service levels without having to involve your customers right away. But I do believe you should involve customers at some point to make sure you set your service levels at the right level, because you may actually find maybe you could drop the pressure a little bit. Maybe your customers would still be happy at 50 psi, say. And if you dropped it a little bit, maybe you don't have to run a booster pump, or you could save some, you know, energy or some cost that way. So, you know, you don't want to be completely locked in without talking to your customers, because there may be opportunities for more of a dialogue and, you know, cost reductions. And then the thing I would say about why are systems reluctant to do levels of service agreements, that is something that we see a lot. When I first learned about asset management over a decade ago, I had gone to New Zealand and Australia and really looked at what they were doing there, and there was lots and lots of transparency with levels of service, and customers knew what was being provided. And then when I brought the idea back to the US, most of the time I would find systems very, very reluctant to ever tell customers what they were doing. And I think a lot of the fear comes from, I don't want them to know, because if I don't do it, they're going to get mad or they'll sue me or whatever. And so what it does is really just create more of that distrust between customers and the utility, when really what you want is, this is what we're trying to do. We're trying to provide service that meets, you know, these particular service levels, like probably pressure, customer service, response times, those kinds of things. And we do need to work at getting to the place where people are comfortable being transparent about what they're trying to do. Hiding it is not really the way to be. We want customers on our side, because if you want to be able to raise a rate, you need them to understand what it is you're trying to do and how you're trying to do it. So I do think this is something we need to go forward, you know, involving customers more, and they've done an excellent job in New Zealand, and I'd like Ross to touch on that, of how you guys have really done a good job involving customers and getting them to understand what it is your utilities are doing.
Thanks, Heather. And I mean, while we've done a good job, we were mandated by legislation to consult. So it was a whole new thing when it came in. couple of really sort of observations out of that process. The first one is several of the smaller systems I've ended up working with over the years, that one of the questions we ask them is like, who are your main customers? Who are your critical customers? And to one case, there was a big meatworks that took half the water in the town. And in another case, it was a big dairy processing plant that did about the same. So you had these massive customers that were on the municipal supply and had, paying for a lot of the water for the town and all those sorts of things. So the next question I asked in both those cases is, do you talk to them at all? Oh, no, we don't. And you say, okay, well, if somebody, in my business, if somebody's 50% of my income, I might choose to talk to them more than once every 10 years. And I think that's a really key point, is to sit down where you do have major industrial or commercial customers, go and talk to them. Find out what's important to them. Find out what you're doing that's frustrating them. Is there anything that you can do to do business better for them, and put that into the mix? And so, I mean, take an example. I know in Albuquerque, where Heather is, there's a massive big Intel fab there, and they use water, a lot of water in those fabs with the process. And so, they would be a major and important part of the economy. Fortune 500 company, obviously, and a major water user. So go talk to your major users. Is there anything that you need to know from them? And so that's at the commercial and industrial level. Do some work in that, and the same if they're a major discharger into your system, the other way around with wastewater. So there's that side of it. The second side with the input from customers is, you've really got to watch out for that squeaky wheel syndrome, where you get people that are jumping up and down because they have a particular issue that is concerning them, and they may not at all be representative of what the community thinks about it. And so when you are doing and looking for customer input, you need to bypass the pressure groups or the if you've got groups that are advocacy groups, you certainly need to listen to what they're saying, but also make sure that you're getting some input from your wider community as to how they feel about service levels. And I think that was the two really big lessons out of that customer interfacing issue that we came across. Is there anything else you want to add there, Heather?
The only thing I'll add is I went to a excuse me, a very amazing meeting when I was in New Zealand the first time I was there, where they had a customer, a session with customers when the community was telling the customers about not just water, but water, roads, parks, all of that type of information, and they were saying what it was going to cost the customers to pay for the water upgrades, pay for the roads, pay for parks, pay for libraries, all that sort of thing. And it was a very different conversation than I've ever seen before, where customers were actually saying things like, oh, you want us to pay more 5 years down the road, and then you're going to extend the pipelines to community A or community B. We would actually like you to move that up to 2 years, and we want to pay more now so that you can run the pipes sooner. So when you can see that kind of conversation take place between customers and elected leaders, where customers are actually trying to engage in that conversation about what the rates will be and what level of service they will get, it's really amazing. And someday I really hope that we start to see more of that in the US, where customers are really tapped into what a utility is trying to do and the money it takes to do that, and they're willing to pay those rates. I think that's a really big step forward that we need to make, and move the conversation into a dynamic of here's what you're getting and here's what you're paying, similar to your cell phone or anything else, where you buy so many minutes and you have so many phone lines and you get so much data and you pay a different amount based on the service you want. And that same conversation needs to be there for water. Is it's a little different in that each customer doesn't get to pick service levels, but it's the same basic idea of where you're tying what somebody is paying to the service that they're getting, and I hope, someday that we're a little bit closer to that.
Yeah, Heather, and that's varied from community to community. We've got some communities over here that really want other people to pay for their stuff still as well. So that conversation that I know goes on occasion in the US is no different anywhere else in the world. It's just different mechanisms for having it. But we have had communities that have, as you say, in that example, that have taken a look at all the services and said, yep, we want to change. We want this stuff earlier and we're prepared to pay for it. Just moving on to that second question about the agreement side of it. Certainly in the US, and I know in the state of Victoria and Australia, the water industries are regulated and have a government or state-appointed regulator. And they have minimum agreements with the regulator as to what service that they provided, and those agreements are then they have to communicate those agreements with the customers. In New Zealand, we don't have that level of regulation in the water industry yet. And it would be fair to say that formal customer charters or customer agreements have been tried in a couple of cases, but they haven't been universally accepted. And I think the issue is around somebody then saying, hey, you didn't meet this, that, or the next thing that's in this agreement, and therefore I'm not paying my bill, or my invoice, or whatever it is. So it's an interesting subject. The places where it's worked best, I think, is where there's actually been a regulatory framework that requires that, and so the customer charter or the customer agreement is effectively that's the law, and so everybody, you're just communicating what the law is to your customers. And so it is an area that's a little bit fraught. What you really got to work your way through is that you're not exposing yourself to unnecessary litigation through an agreement, through sometimes with water systems and wastewater systems or even road networks or anything else. Stuff happens and you can't deliver the service. And so it's about how do you manage that dynamic.
Okay, Dawn, do you have another question?
There are two questions that are similar about population and services provided, so I'll read you both of those. Have you run into situations where replacement costs cannot be supported by current use? What do you recommend when the cost structure points towards discontinuation of service in a particular area? And then similar is about population decrease. Is there a formula, or is research being done to assist utilities balancing aging infrastructure with the possibility that the customer base will decline? The population in our area is declining. If we plan to replace existing infrastructure, we may be overbuilding. Getting this balance correct seems very difficult.
I'll jump in on that one, Heather. That problem that's getting described there is the hardest problem to manage in infrastructure asset management. Growth, whilst it causes you headaches, there's lots of money floating around. So, people are coming into an area, money's getting spent on real estate, property values are holding or going up, there's more taxes getting paid, and so there's money to invest in infrastructure. When you have a declining or shrinking population, and it's never uniform, it's not like one suburb all of a sudden says, oh, look, we're abandoning the suburb. It's a house here and a house there, and it's spread right across the municipality or the county. That question is very, very relevant. And essentially, if you look at Detroit, that's the problem, and they make the headlines quite regularly, but that's the problem they have. They had a population of 1.5 million people in the mid-1970s, and they're down to 700,000 now. So their population has halved in 40-odd years. And they don't have the tax base that they used to have. They still have all the infrastructure that's relating to a city of 1.5 million, and they don't have the money to pay for it. Hence the problem. At a lot smaller scale, I'm dealing with several, we have exactly the same dynamic happening here in New Zealand, and in fact it's right across the Western world. If you type shrinking city towns into Google or shrinking cities, you'll pick up several million page hits. Same issue in the Midwest, I understand, of the US, certainly in the UK, certainly through Europe, starting to hit us here in New Zealand and also in Australia. So it's a problem that we're going to be dealing with for the next 5 decades in reality. What do you do? So the first thing is you need to get some pretty good numbers around what the trends are and how likely they are to continue and what the impact's going to be. The other thing that comes on top of bulk population decline is also in a lot of areas you have quite an aging population, so your demographic is getting older quite quickly. The issue with that is, of course, is that when people are retired and essentially on a fixed income, they have no appetite for paying more for services because they have to make their income stretch for a number of years. So if you're coming into a renewal cycle of assets at the same time as you've got a community that really doesn't have the means or want to pay for anything more, and you're going to have to put tariffs or costs up, you've got a problem, and you're going to get a lot of pushback. So one of the communities I'm dealing with at the moment is in that situation. It's declining quite rapidly, and at the moment they're a town of, let's say they're a couple of thousand people, and they have a municipal water supply which is on demand. It has firefighting capacity, and it has, basically on-demand water to each house, and a treatment system, all those sorts of things. And the conversation we've just started, and we're right in the middle of an asset management plan legislated round of updates here, and the conversation we're starting in this plan, and it'll roll on for probably a decade before we resolve it, is can we maintain that level of service in that town? And the answer, if you actually want to be really harsh about it, is probably no. Particularly once we get into the renewals. So the question is then, do you start dropping the level of service? And so the answer is, well, if we can't afford it, we're going to have to at some stage. And so that might be going in New Zealand for the more rural supplies out in the country. And that we have tanks and restricted supply, and so you're on constant feed of so many gallons a day with a little restriction device that constant feeds that. That completely changes the dynamic of your system. So instead of replacing a pipe with a 4 or 6 inch pipe that's there already, you might drop it down to a 2 inch with a system like that. And instead of having firefighting, you then say, hey, well, if you have a fire at your place, then the tank will be the thing that will do that. You'll pull the water out of the tank, so you don't have to maintain a fire main. Those are really, really hard conversations for communities to have, because it's not the utility that's the problem. The problem is that the community is shrinking and declining, and nobody likes it. The real estate values will be going down as a result. The services in the town, the shops and the supermarket or the mall will be closing up, and it's a symptom of a much wider problem. There's no easy answers to it. Heather, I think I've said enough there.
Yeah, I mean, I think Ross has summed up really well. It is by far the biggest issue in infrastructure because, we often talk about fixed costs and variable costs. And when you have fixed or you have assets in the ground, there is a cost associated with just having those assets there. And whether you serve 1 million gallons a day or 2 million gallons or 100,000 or 10,000, those assets are still there and you still have to maintain them. So that fixed cost isn't going to change. The variable cost might go up or down a little bit because you don't have to pump as much water or you don't have to treat quite as much water, but that's usually a very small portion of your bill. The bigger portion is that fixed cost, for having that infrastructure already in place. So it does become a huge, huge problem, one of which you have to think long term. What does the community look like when we replace the infrastructure the second time around? How are we going to do that? Is it going to be a process like Ross talked about where we're shrinking that infrastructure down to meet a different size population? And the only other suggestion I have is, in many cases, if it's small communities and if there's several small communities around, you can get a little bit of economy of scale by working together. I know that regionalization is not a topic that a lot of people like to hear about, but I think it has a lot of merit, especially in the case where we have a declining population base and we have fewer people that could pay for the services. You have to look for ways to cut your costs. And even if you don't physically interconnect systems, if you develop a managerial structure such that you're part of a bigger operation, that can cut some overhead costs and cut some of your fixed expenses. So, looking to your neighbors to see if there's any opportunities to work together, that might be a way to cut some of your expenses and try to make ends meet, because it does become very difficult going forward if you have that shrinking population base. How are you going to keep paying for the services that you're providing? So again, one of the only tools that we have available is really to come up with a structure, a regional structure, where maybe there's one entity managing several systems and we're kind of pooling resources. Maybe we're sharing operators, we're sharing managers, we're sharing bookkeepers, maybe billing systems, things of that nature, to try to help as much as possible to cut your costs and make it affordable for your customers.
Yeah, the real issue is always, and we've, again, in several of the towns we've got in New Zealand that are shrinking quite rapidly, the most influential person in town, or group of people in town, have chosen to buy houses, big houses and properties on the edge of town. So they don't, so whilst you might have some empty lots and some houses that are, effectively been abandoned or whatever, between them and perhaps the more centre of town where there's a few more people still living, there's no way that they want the services cut out to their mansion out on the edge of town. And that's just a political reality, and they're obviously often very well resourced and very articulate people, and well politically connected as well. And so the issue is, and again, you could look at Detroit as the example there. That growth isn't uniform, and nor is decline. And the trouble is that services go past empty areas before they get to areas that still require the service again, and still cost money to maintain and to replace.
Okay, Dawn, do you have other questions coming in?
Yes. Based on experience at different places, what is the best way to track O&M costs and how to estimate the asset values, depreciation, old equipment refurbishments, for replacement pricing and insurance purposes?
Ross, do you want to tackle that one first?
Yeah, I'm just writing myself a note here. And insurance, right? So we can talk about insurance all day if we wanted to, because we've had lots of recent experience of that with the earthquake we had in Christchurch a few years ago. What we found, just to cover that one off, was that the city was underinsured by a significant margin. When you have a big natural event, often the scale and the issue, they just create more havoc than you realise. In terms of asset value, it really depends again on what you're required or mandated to do by your accounting standards or by your state or federal law. But certainly over here in Australasia, Australia, New Zealand, we're using replacement costs. So it's based on current replacement cost, and it's fundamentally the valuations are updated on a 3 to 5 year cycle depending on the authority and the asset. So what that does is, if you get a breakthrough in say trenchless technology or just the cost of replacing assets, that then feeds back into your valuation, so your valuation can move around a little bit. If you get some more information that says, hey, this pipe that we thought we were going to get 100 years out of, we're only getting 70 years out of it, you can adjust that on that 3 to 5 yearly basis. Again, if you do some condition sampling and for argument's sake, you had a pipe that you said was you're going to get 100 and maybe you're going to get 130 years out of it, again, you can adjust it. We have a few authorities here that are doing yearly valuations, but most would be that 3 to 5. whether I would encourage people to work out a valuation of assets, because that's the next exercise off your asset inventory. So if you build an inventory that says I've got X miles of pipe and I've got X number of pump stations or lift stations, and I've got some treatment plants and some reservoirs or some ponds or storage or whatever it is that you've got. That's step number one. It's actually not that much of an exercise to put a replacement cost against each of those. You need if you have an estimate of life, then you've got a valuation, and from there it's actually very simple maths in a spreadsheet to produce your first cut of a 10, 20, 30, 50 year replacement forecast. And that's where you can stop and have a look at it and go, wow. In our case in New Zealand, and again, I know America's very similar, we had an awful lot of asset construction went in after World War II, so in the period of maybe 1950 to the late 1960s, and particularly in water and wastewater infrastructure. And a lot of that, it's fair to say in the next 20 or 30 years, thereabouts, is all going to need to be replaced. And I would think for a lot of your towns in the US, you're in a similar sort of a situation. So you go, well, hey, we've got maybe a 5 or a 7 or a 10-year window where we're not going to be replacing a lot, but then we've got a lot of replacements that are going to start hitting us. You can start the conversation about how you're going to afford that, how you're going to manage it, what's the best way forward. If you've got a shrinking town, what do you actually do? And plan the thing out and start making some good judgments about it. But that inventory and the valuation is the absolute basis for that. So we're answering the second question first. We'll come back to the R&M cost. Is there anything you want to add to that one, Heather?
I was just going to mention that, it's something that comes up a lot. If the question is also getting at, what kind of computer program do you want to have? And it sounds like a little bit of that was in there of, how would we store this data? And I think you need to be really careful before you go purchase a very expensive computer program to do such things, is make sure you understand what you need and what you want that to do. So as you're looking at the kind of information you want to store, whether you want to store O&M costs, maintenance activities, when you've done them, how much it cost. If you want to store things like, your inventory and life of pipe and replacement values and that kind of thing, really think about what it is that you're trying to store and what kind of computer program you would need. If you're a very small utility, a spreadsheet may be plenty. You may be able to design a spreadsheet that does everything you need to do, and that may work. If you're a larger utility, you may want to do something a little more sophisticated, and there are not, any number of programs out there at all different levels of expenditures. So you don't want to buy something before you know what you want it to do. So I really caution people to think through what it is you're trying to get out of a computer program, what you want to put in, what you want to get out. Think through that before you buy something, because one of the myths that I talked about on a blog that I did on the infomanage.blog site is really people equating a computer program to asset management, and the computer program is not the asset management. The computer program is a tool to help you think through what you need to do. So as you're thinking through replacement cycles, you're thinking through how you want to do operation and maintenance, you really want to clearly decide what is the kind of tool that can help that thinking process. So let the thinking process come first. Really look at what kind of information do I have, what kind of information do I want to store, what do I want to get out of it. If I want to do evaluation, what kind of information do I need, how big is my system, how many assets do I have, and then you can start to see what kind of program. So just that word of caution that as you're looking for ways to store that information, really think through what it is you're trying to do and how you're trying to do it. So Ross, if you want to pick up on the second part of the question.
I'll pick up on that because it also provides a link into this question about the O&M costs. So just for our listeners there, I got the job of rewriting the Asset Information Systems section of the International Infrastructure Manual back in 2011 when it was updated. So it is an area of specialist consulting expertise that I'm recognised for by my peers across Australasia. And in that section of that manual, I put a little bit of guidance based on nearly 30 years of working with these types of systems. There's a whole heap of things that you need to work your way through before you invest in a system. And the first answer to that question is you need to look at your governance. So what is your management and your governance requirements for your organisation? And that will be conditioned by your legislation and your regulations as well. The second thing, having got your governance, this is what are we actually required to get out of this. The second thing you need to answer, and Heather's already talked about it, what outputs do I need? What questions am I trying to answer? And that is a long journey, because when you're starting, you don't even know what the questions are, let alone what you're going to answer. Now, there's plenty of guidance around that, but have a look at, as an organisation and based on the whatever state and local and federal regulations you're having to meet, what questions do I need to answer? Once you know that, then the third thing you need to look at is, well, what information do I actually need to answer those questions? Because one of the mistakes we made in New Zealand when we were a lot younger and a lot newer to this was we bought these big computer systems and we filled them up. And then we said, oh, well, we've got all this information. What are we going to do with it? Oh, I know, we can do this, this, and this. That's not sustainable. We never had the resources to keep that going. And so then the information, the data in the systems degrades and everybody loses confidence in it, and on it goes. And you're into a cycle of replacing everything. So, so governance, and then outputs, then inputs. Then you look at your business processes, because you've got existing business processes within your organisations, be that out in the field with the OMN guys or in the office. And you've got, and if you go into some sort of system or even try and improve your current paper systems or whatever it is you're doing, you have existing business processes that have developed over a long period of time for very good reasons. Once you understand the outputs, what your managers and your governors need from you, the inputs that you need, and how that's going to fit with your business processes, then you're in the place where you can actually answer the question about what computer program do I want. And that can be as simple as a spreadsheet or a very simple GIS up to a very sophisticated database system, depending on the size and the answers to those previous questions. Part of that question about O&M costs fits into that, because it's still, with the O&M costs, what outputs am I actually required? They're part of the same question. And for some organisations, they'll have one general ledger line that says operations and maintenance for the entire organisation, and they'll only know at that level. They'll know they spend, for argument's sake, $100,000 or $1 million or $10 million a year or whatever the figure is on O&M. That'll be all they know, and they'll know that that's been stable or it's going up or it's going down per year. You come down a level to that, you might say, well, actually we look after 15 towns in the system, or 10 towns, so I might try and break those O&M costs out by town, so I know is one town costing me more than the next. You come down a level below that, then you would be saying, well, what are my O&M costs for my pipe network or my pumps or my treatment facilities? And so you could run those costs at that level, and that's all giving you different outputs and different information. Where some of our authorities in Australasia and New Zealand have got to is that we are picking up O&M costs for every single pipe break and holding that against individual assets. And that's taken us 15 years to get to. The reason we got there is that we're starting, as I said earlier, we're starting to get into the replacement of that 1950s and 60s infrastructure that went in, and it starts coming back to, well, how do I know what the economic cost of those those breaks and repairs are versus the cost of replacing it. And when you're starting to try and answer those sorts of questions, you can do it by risk, you can do it by whole of network, or you might be holding break costs for whole of network or whatever it is. But some authorities have said, hey, no, we want to know that on an individual pipeline basis, and so they're collecting that information. But it has to be driven by what outputs do you need. And that's also part of the question around computer systems. Heather.
Yeah, I was just going to mention, Ross, you might want to click through to our contact slide, because I realized we don't have that up, and we have made mention a couple of times to some websites, and I wanted to just have that up for people to see as we continue the discussions. You can see mine, Dawn's, and Ross's contact information there if you have questions, following the webinar. And as well, we have a couple of resources that I just want to point out to you. For this particular project, the Small Water System Managerial Financial Assistance Project with EPA, we have a dedicated project website. That's the top one, efcnetwork.org. And we also have a couple of other websites for you. One is Ross's infrastructure management website. That's his company. And then the third one is a very exciting website, the inframanage.com website. That has some blogs and videos and many good resources, and Ross and I are both contributors to that website, so you're welcome to go there and look at all the resources that are available. There's always interesting discussions going on, and you can sign up to get updates as to what's been posted on the website if you would like, and you can check back and see the new blog posts about infrastructure, and there's a variety of topics that are covered, and as I said, there's also some videos and all kinds of things there. So just wanted to make you aware that there are resources also to help you out with asset management. So before continuing, I just wanted to make sure everybody had that contact information and saw where they could go to get additional resources.
And Heather, just quickly on InfraManage, I'm just between now and Christmas putting up a 16 video series on the topics around asset planning and some of these topics we're talking about today. And so have a look at that series on InfraManage. They'll be going up sort of once a week starting next week, and quite looking forward to just discussing some of these topics as we go along through that medium as well.
So again, just wanted to point out those resources. Dawn, do we have some additional questions?
There are. So the next question is, why should the utility worry about the cost of pipe breaks that don't affect the utility? For example, blocking traffic.
So I think, are they saying that, I'm guessing they're saying that they're not blocking traffic? Is that the way you read that?
This came whenever we had the earlier discussion about the costs that were associated with the water line break in LA. And so, you were talking about the various costs that were associated with that water line break. And so the question is, why should the water utility worry about the costs that don't have a direct impact on the water utility specifically? So for this utility, they don't pay for traffic blocking. That would come from a different
it would certainly vary from community to community, but many communities actually have to pay for those services. So in the case where a community has to pay for that, which does happen in many cases, at least for bigger cities, where if you're having to call in folks who are going to put up the traffic barricades, and you're going to have to pay cops or police, to go out and direct traffic, or if there's a road repair, oftentimes utilities might even have to pay for some of that road repair. So in that case, it would tie to the utility. If there's a case where the utility does not have to pay those costs, I would not ignore them even though they're not tied directly to the utility, because the utility has still created that expense for the community as a whole.
It's a total cost to the community, isn't it? And that's,
yes.
I think one of the things, once you start getting into infrastructure asset management, you start looking a little bit more holistically around the costs, and even though they might not be accruing to your particular authority, there's still a cost that's accruing to your community one way or the other. So that's money that could have been spent elsewhere doing something more productive is getting spent on an emergency.
And you know, if you would look at, say, a road budget, so maybe the community has a road budget of, you know, let's just pick a number. They have a $500,000 road budget for the year, and if they have to spend $250,000 of that budget dealing with road repairs from pipe breaks, that's $250,000 that they couldn't have done another project. You know, maybe there was a street widening or a sidewalk improvement or something else that they were trying to do. So I think we have to be really, really careful about saying that if we're not directly paying for it, it doesn't matter. I believe that those costs still matter to the utility. The utility should still consider them even if they're not directly the bottom line of that utility, because somebody has to pay for it, and ultimately your customer base is probably that somebody, because they're going to have to pay taxes or fees or something that will pay for the services elsewhere. So even if they're paying for other, you know, public services like police or barricading or road repairs, you know, they're paying for it somehow, some way. It's not coming out of the sky. It is coming out of those pockets. And the other thing to think about is different breaks have different criticality to a water utility. So a small break on a side street that is just trickling down the road, impacting a couple of customers, is not the same as, you know, a major water main break that, you know, impacts the whole town, causes major traffic disruptions, hurts the road, floods out a street, causes a sinkhole. I mean, there are degrees of criticality, and that's part of asset management, is trying to figure out which pipes are going to be critical for you. I happened to be in Boston in 2010, ironically enough, for a meeting about better managing water utilities, and that's when Boston had their major water main break, and it cut off supplies to the entire city. So that pipe to them was, you know, monumentally critical because it was supplying the entire city. When they brought in emergency supplies, they weren't treated, so, you know, it wasn't safe to drink, and they were under a boil notice, and it created major havoc within the city of Boston. So that would be very, very different than a pipe that was on, you know, some side street in Boston. You know, it wouldn't have had that same level of criticality. So it is important to think about, you know, criticality and how that impacts things. But again, I would say think of the overall cost, whether or not your utility is specifically paying it. It's still a holistic cost that's associated with that break, and you want to think in the triple bottom line way of what is the financial impact, what is the environmental impact, and what is the social impact. You know, what are the impacts to customers, to businesses, to your standing as, you know, prized public service. You know, how is your how does the public feel about you as a result of that? So you really want to think all three ways, not just the money, but the money, any environmental impact, and then any social impact that occurs from that particular event, and then look at the criticality of different types of events.
I think too, Heather, and I've just clicked back to that slide from Toledo, Ohio, because they've recently had the do not drink for their entire population due to that algae getting through their treatment plant. And a different, yeah, that's a different cause of the problem than a break or the Boston one. But the issue is when you've got do not drink out for an entire city, there's a massive disruption and actual cost to while that notice is in place. And so, you know, the stories for Toledo were they had queues around the block for people queuing up to get water from the market or from the shop, and people were getting, you know, you can come and you can only buy two bottles of water or whatever it was. So instead of just getting on with life as normal, people are queuing for water, and then they're having to go back and queue for some more, and they had, I understand that the National Guard was shipping in water from the neighbouring counties and places like that, and on it goes. And when I did the blog post on that, the question I asked is, what price water? Because we tend to, when it's all working well, we tend to go, oh yeah, I pay too much for my water. Try living in a place where the water gets shut off for a while, and all of a sudden you realise that you'll pay anything you have to get water, and it'll be far, far more than your utility bill or invoice for that period. And there's some really good studies out of places like Manila where the really poor, the people that are living on the rubbish dumps are paying 100 times more for their water than the people that live in houses, because they've got on-demand tap water, and the people in the rubbish dump have to go and buy it from a water seller who's buying it from the utility, who's carting it around in 10-gallon drums. The simple issue is you've got to have it. And so you can do those sorts of analysis and say, well, hey, if we up our budget a bit, we're going to avoid some of these problems, and therefore do stuff in a planned way, be it pipe renewal or dealing with source and things like that, which is the issue with Toledo, and then that's actually over a 10-year period or longer, a far more cost-effective than lurching from crisis to crisis.
Dawn, do we have any other questions?
Yes. Do you have any advice on how to convince a small system that they need to have an asset management plan?
My advice is that it's very important to work with them on whatever their biggest problem is and show them how asset management can help them solve that issue as a way to get them bought in. So for example, if their biggest problem is many pipe breaks, then think about how does asset management help them deal with that issue. How do we, say, shrink the program down to just dealing with pipe as a starting place and say, okay, well, let's inventory maybe just the most critical pieces of pipe as a starting place. Where are your bigger mains? Where are your major transmission mains? Maybe what's the main that takes from your source to the distribution system in town? Do you have any of those single pipes where if they would fail, a major problem would occur? So, maybe start there of looking at, well, what's the situation with your pipes that are causing you the biggest problem? Now let's look at, well, what kind of problem are you actually having? Where are those breaks actually occurring? Most of the time, they're not randomly dispersed throughout the system. More often, they occur on similar types of pipe, sizes, ages, soil conditions. There's usually something in that community that is causing more breaks in one type of pipe or one particular area than another. So if you start to focus in on, well, what is really the nature of the problem, we can have a better solution. So now instead of looking at, maybe they have, for argument's sake, 30 miles of pipe that's fairly critical to them, and you find out that breaks are occurring in only maybe a quarter mile of that 30-mile section. Well, now we've shrunk down what they have to do to only a quarter mile of the 30 miles. So now we've reduced the cost of their actions going forward substantially. And so when they, many communities, when they have breaks, at least I've seen this in small communities, they say, oh, we got to replace all the pipe. And you don't. You need to look at where the problems are and replace only those sections that really need it. But the way you do that is by getting that information about, well, what's your inventory, where are the pipes, what kind of pipes are they, what level of service do you want, how many breaks per mile can you tolerate, and then looking at criticality, which pipes are most important, and then looking at, well, could I replace just a small segment of my pipes and really make an impact on my breaks, so that now instead of replacing 30 miles, I'm replacing a quarter mile or less. The cost differential would be tremendous. Instead of being maybe 15 million to replace all their pipes, maybe it's only a couple $100,000. because they're shrinking it down to the pieces that really matter. So I think when you approach it more from what is your issue, the biggest issue you're facing right now as a small community, and how can asset management help you solve that issue? And then if we can address that issue, we can start expanding the program to, say, the rest of your pipe, and now your wells, tanks, valves, hydrants, whatever else you happen to have in the system. But sometimes when we go in as more of a just a generic program, if you will, of, okay, take an inventory, do this, do that, it doesn't have as much impact as if we can actually talk to them about, what are the issues you're having and how do you want to solve those issues using an asset management approach, because you are managing your assets now, but you're not doing it in the most efficient, most cost-effective way possible. If you change the way you manage your assets, you can have significant cost savings, efficiency benefits, but you kind of need to prove it to them by showing how asset management can actually work for a small community.
And Heather, look, one of the things we've found, that it's very easy when you're a small system to look at a 200 or 300 page asset management plan that's been produced for LA or New York or a major system and go, well, that's just ridiculous. We can't do that. And the short answer is you don't need to do that. And I'm just thinking about that asset plan that you sent me a copy of from a really little town in New Mexico who had a voluntary custodian who was in his 70s, I think. I was really impressed with him. And he'd written a 15-page asset plan. He had a one-page asset register that was typed on the, in the appendix at the back. And he'd used your Kansas model that you'd developed. And it was just scaled really appropriately for a really small system that had a voluntary custodian. Do you just want to talk us through that a little bit more, Heather?
Yeah, I think this particular community was having some issues, and they really wanted to get the system in better shape, and they're very, very small community. And so they really set about, what level of expertise could they have in their community, and they actually started it on a piece of paper because that was the level at which they were comfortable. And we told them, because you don't have a lot of assets, that's a perfectly fine way to start, because that gives you the comfort level that you need to get going. And it's okay if it's not going to get into a computer until later. You're at least starting. So he was starting through, going through his pipe, his wells, his tanks, and again, small system, so there wasn't a lot of assets. And then they just slowly walk through the whole process of, okay, we've inventoried, we'll do a level of service, we'll do criticality. And again, in a small system, there aren't a lot of components, so they could really structure this asset management plan to very quickly get to the heart of their issues. And they were able to, in, what was it, about 15 or 20 pages.
Yeah, it was quite small.
Really sum up the whole process and what they need to do. And I don't really feel like asset management plans need to have a lot of the theory behind asset management, because that's available. That's out there in any number of, thousands of different publications. So you don't really need a lot of that in your plan. You can cut right to the chase. We have this much pipe, we have this many pumps, we have this much, this many wells. Here in the back, appendix whatever A has a list of our infrastructure, or if you want to refer to a computer program, here's the kind of data we collect, here's how we collect it. And so you can be really cut and dry with the process. It does not have to have lots of complex, graphs and figures and charts. It can be very, very simple. And I think that it needs to fit the level of sophistication of the people who are going to use it and fit their culture. It doesn't really do a lot of good to give somebody, really grandiose graphs and charts that they don't feel comfortable using. So I feel like the plan should really be, what feels comfortable to me? How can I use this data going forward? And if I can do it in 15 pages, then 15 pages is plenty. you don't need more unless you have more to say that's really valuable to you. You don't have to spend 100 pages talking about all the theory behind asset management. You can just talk about, well, here's what we're going to do going forward, here's how we're managing now, here's level of service, here's the way we're going to measure it. It can be real cut and dry and keep it very, very simple, at the level that that community feels comfortable.
And Heather, look, the thing, I met the gentleman in Albuquerque who wrote that, and the thing that impressed me was he was a private individual who was just helping as I think a voluntary custodian for his community of the water system. And he was, if he wasn't 75, he was that sort of age, if not a bit older, and I was just really impressed with him. Here he was, applying his life's experience to help his community, this nice little simple asset plan, and it just, he wasn't an engineering professional or anything like that. And I think the thing that really helped him, he was using your asset management from Kansas manual, and he'd been to a seminar or two, and that's just a really good resource for small communities, I think, and that's on your website, isn't it?
Yes.
So,
he was kind of interesting because he had actually come to a training session that we had done one time in Albuquerque, and he was very, very interested, and he actually used it as his goal was to work his way off the board. He had been a board member on this particular water system for quite a while, and his idea was, if I can get the system in better shape, I can retire and somebody else can take over. So his goal was, he saw it as a way to really make the system better and leave it in better hands, and maybe somebody might want to be a board member because it was better run and had better information. And then he came back a year later for a similar training, and the first thing I said to him is, oh, I see that you're back. I just wanted to let you know that it's going to be a very similar course, and you're welcome to stay, but just know that it's a repeat. And he says, oh, no, the reason I'm here is to share with you that I've done my plan. So he literally spent the year, using our AM Can Work manual that we gave him at the training, and used it as a way to sort of walk himself through the process. And then he had come back to kind of show what he had done, and then he had asked for some suggestions of how to continue the process. So it just showed me that somebody who, was not a water professional, but just had spent a lot of time, as a board member for this particular system, really was able to think through the process, cut it down to really what was important to them in a very short amount of time and amount of pages to fit the level that was comfortable for their system. So we don't need to have, super high level sophistication. We just need the thought process to be there. We just need the thinking part to be there, thinking about what assets you have, what you want them to do, which ones are critical, how you're going to maintain them for their, life cycle, and then how you're going to pay for it. Those 5 basic components need to be in there, but there's lots of room to tailor the sophistication level, up or down depending on a system. So it can be done at a very small level.
It starts simple, isn't it? That's the key.
Exactly.
Make lots of little steps, and that to me though too, it's just such an inspiring story. There's people like that in communities right across the world, but particularly across the US, who are putting their time into making their communities a better place. And for all the negativity that's out there in the world, those are good news stories. I like hearing them.
Dawn, do we have some other issues or questions that have come in?
There is, are there industry standards for level of service?
Well, my take on that is there are a few that are more set by regulatory nature, that you want to make sure that you're meeting all of the Safe Drinking Water Act requirements, all of the state's requirements, and then typical best practice in terms of what you're doing with pressures and things like that. But I think they're pretty open, beyond that, to fit the community's customer needs. And I'll let Ross talk about whether they have industry standards, in New Zealand. But I think, in a lot of cases we're fairly open to you know, some of the other standards like customer service, you know, how much your response time is more specific to your community and what your community expects from you, as opposed to saying the industry says it better be within 2 hours or 4 hours or something like that.
Yeah, I think the thing is, as you said here, the baseline for levels of service in water, wastewater, and even stormwater networks is that regulatory floor. You know, you will have a series of regulations and laws and/or state, federal, local ordinances that you're required to meet, and they will set your base service levels. And presumably you're either fairly close to meeting them, or you need to do some work in that area if you aren't. Certainly, once you get above that, the next step example is the UK, really, where they have the Office of the Water Regulator, and the similar sort of setup in the state of Victoria in Australia, where the water regulator then sets a levels of service that at a fairly high level that must be met. And if you're interested in those, and they're for very large water supplies. I mean, those ones in the UK are serving, you know, 10, 15 million, 20 million people each. And so, but you can go to the UK Office of the Water Regulators, OFWAT, Ofwat, and they have those published, and they have league tables and things like that. Here in New Zealand, we've just had a change in legislation, and the regulations that followed from that have just kicked in the last few months, and we have some mandatory performance measures that must be reported. So the level of service isn't specified, but you have to report now in the public domain every year how you're meeting these performance measures. And again, they're specified by our equivalent of your federal government. But the finer points of the service delivery aren't. So it fundamentally depends on your regulatory environment, I think, as to what they are, and then as Heather said, the custom in your area. What works for one place will be different for another place.
Don, any others?
There are, and I think we'll have to cover some of them in the Q&A that we put on our website at the end, because we aren't going to be able to address all of them. But very briefly, Ross, a question about the videos that you're going to put on the website. They wanted to know if those videos would be downloadable.
Yes, they will. So what we're planning to do on inframanage.com is I'm doing a series of 16 videos, starting with an introduction to AM and then working my way through. From there'll be a 5-minute video that will be in, you'll have to subscribe, but they'll be free. So that'll be, it's going to have a practical basis rather than theoretical, and I'm going to just try and cover an overview of each subject in 5 minutes, so that people that working in authorities that, or even in the developing countries or wherever, that can't afford to pay for stuff can download those videos. There'll be transcripts with them as well. I'm also doing a matched pair of each of those 5-minute ones, a 20 to 30-minute one, and that'll be in the subscription area of the site. That will be a paid subscription. So, but that'll cover stuff in a lot more detail. And then even some of those, I think we're going to go from there and then break them out. So, for argument's sake, the subject of risk is one that you could spend weeks on if you wanted to. Demand management's another one. Some of the life cycle asset management, 20 minutes is only going to be scratching the surface. So we're going to do this initial series from now through to Christmas, and then into 2015 start unpacking a few more of them based on the comments and the interaction we get.
And Don, I think we're getting pretty much to the end of 90 minutes, but maybe we'll do one more question before we wrap up, and then what I would say is Ross and I would like to do these as a series about once a quarter. So what we might do is maybe hang on to some of these questions as a starting point for the next Ask the Expert webinar. So Don, if you want to pick out another question, and then maybe we'll address that one, and then perhaps we'll see if we can save some of these questions to the next Ask the Expert webinar.
We're certainly trying to do them once a quarter now, aren't we, Heather? So there'll be another one before Christmas, I think.
Okay, one of the keys to asset management is improving preventative maintenance. Do you have a list of best management practices for preventative maintenance for water distribution and wastewater collection, along with cost estimates for best practices?
Ross, do you want to tackle that one?
That's a huge subject. The short answer to that is that clients I work with sometimes pay me for up to a year to help them with the answer to that question. So this depends on your network. And again, if you've got state or federal guidelines around delivery of service for preventative maintenance, I think that at a very broad brush level, again, coming back to what Heather was talking about earlier about identifying your critical assets and your critical risks, and then getting your preventative maintenance programs really sorted out around those is the first hitting point. I'll give you a tiny little example of that. One of our clients here in New Zealand had a preventative maintenance program, but they were also starting to run into quite a few water breaks. And so one of the things we did was we said, well, look, we'll split your assets up into 3 levels. So there's the suburban reticulation that if it breaks, it might affect, you know, perhaps 10 or 15 houses or something like that per break. Then you've got in between that, so we wanted 3 levels of critical there. So in between that, we've got suburban shopping malls or shopping centres. We might have other more critical assets. So there was a band in the middle there, and then there was a band of highly critical assets, the main feeders and things like that, and stuff feeding hospitals and schools and those sorts of things. So what we did is we then said, well, hey, in terms of preventive maintenance, the ones in the highest group, we need to put some effort into what are we doing there, what inspections we're doing. But one of the decisions they made, which I thought we helped them with, but it's quite interesting at the end, was they said, hey, we're happy to have, it was a smaller town, 3 to 5 breaks in those suburban ones, and then we might start looking at it from a engineering management point of view, what we're going to do. The middle group, the suburban shopping mall group, if you like, they said, look, if we have 2 breaks from the field in that area, we're then going to start giving it some more analysis. With those critical assets, they said, right, the first break we get, that's our canary in the mine. That if we get a break there, then what we're going to do is we're going to have the engineers out on site before we fix it. So we want to see what's happening. And so it's doing that, and it's attacking your highest risks first in terms of your program. That would be the very short answer.
Yeah, and I would just mention that you know, one of the things to think about with your system when you get into preventative maintenance is you can start watching over time how preventative maintenance impacts your system. So, for example, if you start doing preventative maintenance on a pump, you could look and see, well, I never used to do it before, and the pump would last, say, you know, 15 years. And now I started doing it, and if I watch it for the next 20 years, it lasts longer. You can start to make decisions on your own about how important preventive maintenance is for different pieces of equipment by watching what you're doing, how you're doing it, what it costs, and it'll take you some time to do that, but that's okay. I mean, it's okay if it takes a while to really get good at this. You know, as Ross has mentioned before, it's taken, you know, 15 years or more for some of the really good things to start happening in New Zealand and Australia. Well, it can take us a while too. As long as we're moving in the right direction, we're doing well. I've seen many utilities that did not have a preventative maintenance program were completely in reactive mode, so that, you know, we're not going to do any maintenance until something breaks. That's a really expensive way to be. That would be kind of like, you know, driving your car and saying, I'm not going to do anything. I'm not going to change the oil. I'm not going to, you know, change the fuel filter. I'm not going to rotate the tires. I'm not going to do you know,
I've got an uncle that does that with one of my uncles does that with his cars, and he blows his engines up on a fairly regular basis. You know?
Exactly. So that's the whole point is, like, you can do that. You can choose to be in completely reactive mode, but if you are, you will pay a very high price. So the fact that maybe for 5 years or in my car I did absolutely nothing, I will still get maybe 5 years out of my car. But at some point I am going to do something like, you know, blow a head gasket or burn up the engine, or, you know, the car is going to crash because the brakes fail. And that's a really bad way to operate. I mean, we would never want to do that with our car. And besides your uncle, most of us would rather put in the money, as much as we don't like to pay for car maintenance. We understand the value of it because it keeps the, you know, the $20,000 investment or whatever it is, able for us to continue to drive it. So the same is true for water utilities. They're not different. If we don't put in the preventative maintenance up front, and we don't do those routine things that we should, it is not going to last as long. We will get away with it for a while, just like with your car or anything else, but you will pay the price in the end, and the price will be so much higher than if we did the preventive maintenance at the beginning. And initially it's hard to make that switch between being very reactive and being proactive. But after you get going and you start doing some preventative maintenance, you will start to see a benefit from having done it. But initially, you're still going to be in reactive mode, and you have to do preventative maintenance. And so you will, for a little while, have to bite the bullet and do a little bit of both. But as you do that preventative maintenance, your corrective work will start to drop off. And because that's more time-consuming and more expensive, you will start to reap the benefit. And then you can do more preventative maintenance, and the more preventative maintenance you do, again, the less corrective you do. And so it starts a cycle that heads you in the right direction. So even just starting a little bit at a time, you can start to see benefits. So I would encourage anybody to start looking at, well, what kind of preventative maintenance can we do, and how can we really you know, make a difference at our system. So with that, I think just to be conscious of the fact that on the East Coast, I know it's getting pretty close to the end of the work day, and it's always kind of a challenge when you have very many time zones involved to try to pick a time that's good for everybody. So we did the best we could of picking a time that kind of doesn't have Ross up in the middle of the night and kind of allows people from all the time zones within the U.S. to participate. So knowing that, we'll try to wrap up now and send you on your way. And we have very much enjoyed spending this time with you. And again, we'll maybe hold these questions for the start of the next Ask the Expert webinar series. And that would be a nice starting place for the next one that we'll do. We'll have another one before Christmas. We'll send out to everybody the date of that webinar. And you have the contact information up on the screen. You know, feel free to look at the EFC Network webpage, the InfraManage webpage, Ross's War Infrastructure webpage. You know, contact us if you have additional questions, and then look forward to another webinar in about another couple of months here. And then Ross has done some nice blog posts about the previous Ask the Expert webinar. We have the audio podcast is available on the EFC Network website, and then there are some nice blog posts that came out of that that Ross has on the InfraManage site, so you can look through some of those. So we, again, thank you all for participating, and any last words you'd like to say, Ross?
Oh, really enjoyed it, Heather. It's been as much fun as the last one, and I think we'll look to schedule one in sort of November at some stage and do it again. It's a really good opportunity, and thank you for everybody that's been here for participating and for the questions. They've been really good questions.
Yes, thank you all.
Thank you. Have a great day.